This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Chapter 9, Social Class, Do Money and Power Matter in Sports? And I can't help but say, yes. That's the short answer. Your hosts are Jay, the nonpareil Coakley, and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. So this is a good topic.
Yeah. This one excites me a lot. One of the reasons, I think the reason that it excites me, or one of the reasons I should say, is, over the past few decades in sociology, we've really gotten good at studying race and gender and sexuality, which is fantastic. Those are important things to study. But surprisingly, we haven't been as good at studying class as we have at identity. And I would say the reasons are, beyond this episode, but this is a big problem because we have a distorted image of reality. For instance, researchers have found that people in the United States believe that the wealthiest people in the nation they believe that the wealthiest people in the nation own 59% of the nation's wealth. But they also believe they should only own 32% of the nation's wealth. They think that that would be fair and optimal for a democratic society. But guess what? The wealthiest own 84% of the nation's wealth. So while people in the U.S. dream about a greater economic equity than what actually exists, the real situation is in fact a whole lot worse than they even imagine. So let's begin this discussion where we typically start, and that's by focusing on ideology, and class ideology more specifically. In the United States, people tend to see sport as an avenue of social mobility for motivated poor kids. And of course, there is a degree of truth to that. And in fact, as I've talked about in previous episodes, this was how my grandfather narrated his life. So there's certainly some truth to it. But Jay, can you talk about some of the ways that the data challenges this rosy view of the American dream?
Well, that's the topic that we call social stratification, where we talk about the extent to which inequality exists in the United States. And that's interesting because it exists simultaneously with all of these statements that people make about the U.S. being the land of opportunity and anybody can make it if you just try hard enough. If you can dream it, you can be it. You get what you deserve and you deserve what you get. So basically, how do we think about social stratification and socioeconomic inequality in the United States? Well, we use what we in sociology call social class ideology. And basically, that's a widely shared set of interrelated ideas and beliefs that people use to understand economic inequalities and identify their own social class position. Where do I fit within this system? And evaluate the impact of economic inequalities on the organization of social worlds. Now, that social class ideology really brings together two major beliefs. And one of them is a belief in the American dream, which is the U.S. is the land of opportunity, basically, and the belief that the United States is a meritocracy. In other words, that you get what you deserve. If you've worked hard, made the right decisions, if you have good character, then you're more likely to be successful than other people. And the people who fail are the people who are making poor decisions, the ones who don't have strong positive characters, and those uh, who are basically less responsible than others. So so when we talk about sports as being an avenue for social mobility, uh, it's because we also see sports as a place where you succeed through hard work and you succeed through personal discipline. But whether that is going to carry over into payoffs in the rest of society is really the rub here, because that transfer doesn't happen automatically or smoothly. So so we've really created a myth about sports as being an avenue for upward social mobility for everyone.
It's a very powerful myth. And I think one of the reasons that we embrace this myth is that we see sports, as you said, as a meritocracy, right? Hard work, discipline, perseverance, right? People succeed. And for me, nothing captures this more than the sports metaphor of a level playing field. And this really idealizes the idea that everyone is equal before the law. Although biases and inequities do, in fact, impact the playing field, I want to focus on how social forces outside of the playing field create an uneven playing field, both on and off the pitch. So let's begin by focusing on the assumption that hard work, persistence, and discipline lead to success in sports, since research finds success requires a lot of really expensive resources, like state-of-the-art training facilities and coaching. Can you talk about some of the ways that the unequal distribution of resources throughout society creates unequal sports participation and outcomes?
Yeah, the things that you've just mentioned are really important, because if you want to be good in sports as an individual, you have to have access to certain kinds of facilities, spaces, equipment, uh, guidance, and you have to be a part of a community where enough people in that community have access to the same resources, that you have a critical mass of young people, for example, to create youth sports teams, and or you have a critical mass of people who are playing a lot of different sports that could be available in high school. And then the other issue is, in those neighborhoods, are there the resources to have those open spaces, those parks, those playing fields, that park and recreation department that has enough resources to hire people to create the programs, to hire the referees, and all of those things that it takes to run a sport program. Now, I think some of the beliefs that people have about sport being an avenue for upward social mobility date back to a time when suburbanization was occurring in the United States, and as these suburbs were being built for people who were middle and upper middle class, there were parks structured into developmental plans. There were transportation systems developed into those plans, and young people came from families in those suburban areas that had the resources to get to those parks, to bring the equipment to those parks, and park and recreation departments had the public money, the taxes that were being collected in those areas, to have programs where they would supply not only the fields in local public parks, but they supplied the equipment and the uniforms, except for a baseball glove. For example, in baseball, So when I played Little League in 1954 in one of those suburban areas in a park across the street that was maintained by public funds, the Little League was maintained by public funds, and the coaches were volunteers, and those public funds bought our uniforms. They bought all the catcher's equipment. They bought the special the bats and the balls. So that was a time when tax money was being used to provide support for all the people in that community. But again, it was a special community of middle class and upper middle class people. And at the same time in Chicago, there were publicly supported programs for a lot of young people, even young people who came from poor neighborhoods. But then when we got to the 1980s and there were tax revolts across the country, Ronald Reagan got elected on a very conservative platform that basically said, look, we want to emphasize individual responsibility. You know, we're gonna move away from this funding the community, so to speak, and we're gonna ask people to fund themselves, families to fund themselves. And once that happened, park and recreation departments lost the resources to maintain those free and low-cost programs. And then we started moving to a pay-to-play model, which we have today. So there have been major changes over the past couple of generations when it comes to access to the kinds of participation opportunities that you need to experience upward mobility in sport and cash that in for upward mobility in the rest of society.
So as I promised, I'm going to say, if anyone listening to this podcast wants a term to apply to this much larger process that Jay's describing that took place in the really starting in the mid 70s, but accelerating in the 1980s, in the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan, in 1979, if you were in Britain, with the election of Margaret Thatcher as prime minister. We call that neoliberal capitalism. We could put a name to this much larger process. And so there were these profound changes in the way that the economy works, and that then translated into changing how all of society works, right? And that has profound impact on people's lives. But I wanted to pick up something, a thread that you identified, Jay, which is the importance of suburbanization. And I've thought about this a lot because, again, going back to that grandfather who narrated his life, as, I worked hard. Sports was central to my success. I earned a scholarship, even though they didn't have scholarships when he went to college to, the University of Illinois. Well, so my grandfather was born in what in sociology we call an ethnic enclave, or it was a Jewish ghetto on the south side of Chicago. He did it was a cold water tenement in, I forget the year, I think it was 1913 when he was born. They used to walk to the YMCA to take showers, so on and so forth. And it's interesting to me because he played football, but when he was born, sports that Jews were famous for were boxing and basketball, because those sports fit into inner city communities, inner city neighborhoods, into those ethnic enclaves. The part that we tend to leave out of the family history is they saved up their money and they were able to move to a suburb. And in the suburbs, there was space for football fields and baseball fields and things like that. Because in inner city spaces, there was no space for those fields. The reason he could play football was because he moved to the suburbs. And we get confused about this stuff, right? I mean, we can tell a true story about my grandfather that leaves out some very important details, and it creates a picture of how society works, how the world works, and the way in which sport it's just this natural expression, when in fact there are all these other sort of forces at work. Another example that I want to bring up is boxing, because we often talk about boxing as creating this opportunity structure for the poorest people. And we'll say, in fact, it is poverty that creates the hunger that it takes to be successful in boxing. And so it's always the poorest people in society that are the most likely to become successful boxers. And that is true to a point. And I give an example. So Mexico, Puerto Rico, given their population size, produces an incredible percentage of world champion fighters and just great fighters, right? No question about it. And I would say they're, mid-income, lower to mid-income nations. And so, in fact, the poverty that people experience there is fuel for their sports participation. But then, what about really low income nations? I'm thinking about like El Salvador in Central America, Chad in Africa. They don't produce very many world championship fighters. I can't think of a single world champion from Chad. I mean, there might be, but I can't think of. So when looking at the number of successful boxers from high, middle, and low income nations, it's clear that poverty alone does not create successful boxers. And in fact, one of the things that the research finds is that poverty could actually be a barrier to being a successful boxer. Hey, Jay, can you also talk about how the uneven flow of resources to communities creates an unequal landscape where wealthier people have greater access to fitness, recreation, and health resources?
Yeah, I think that anybody who has looked at what goes on in low-income urban areas versus upper middle-class suburban areas, you see right away that the people who have resources in those upper middle income suburban areas will create country clubs. They'll create tennis clubs. They'll create swim clubs and lacrosse clubs, and they have the spaces within which they can play those sports. They have the facilities, the venues through which they can become involved in those sports. And those clubs, by the way, are family-based places. So what happens is the parents join a country club, a swim club, a tennis club, and the kids come along with them, and they see their parents playing, and then they play. And so you have this generational transfer of the motivation to play, and you have access to relatively expensive facilities that require either a lot of property or a venue, an expensive venue to play in. And those young people have opportunities that are just not available in even many middle-class communities, and certainly low-income communities. So there are certain sports that are just out of bounds for people who come from low-income communities, whose family income and family wealth is low. And that is a socioeconomic phenomenon, but it's also a racial and an ethnic phenomenon. And we know that, for example, white families in the United States have 10 times the wealth of a black family, of black families, and about the same over Hispanic families, Latinx families. So basically, those white families, on average, have the resources to give them access to a whole lot more sport participation than young people in Black and Latinx families. And on average, so So we're talking about an intersection here between social class and race and ethnicity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really started thinking about this. Last summer, I was volunteering with an organization in where I live in the Colorado Springs area that provides bicycle camps to kids. They're called Kids on Bikes. Great organization. They do all sorts of great things to address socioeconomic inequities. But we were on the north side. This camp was held at a park on the north side of town, and this is in the chapter. When you read it, you'll, if you haven't already read it, you'll see this. I was at the park. It was called Cottonwood Park, and I was waiting for the camp to start, and I was looking around this park, and it has multiple um, baseball baseball diamonds. It's got tennis courts. It's got it's got an inline skate hockey rink. It's connected to this incredible trail system for riding your bikes, and the Cottonwood Creek is right there. You can ride along. It's got disc golf. You throw the frisbees and play golf. Right. There's so many. There's a YMCA there. There are so many different things. Um, sport and fitness resources there that are available for anyone to just freely use in that community. And a lot of what pays for it is the tax base, because it's a higher income families, lots of family owned houses, single family owned houses, and so there's all this tax revenue there. But also, these are people who are very effective at advocating for their own needs, which is great. That's what we all should be able to do. But because of differences in class, they have the education, they have the connections, and they have the know-how to be able to advocate to get things like this incredible park built. And then I look at parks in other parts of town, and they're not nearly so nice. So one of the things that this means is kids in a wealthier neighborhood, simply because of their zip code, they have access to all of these great health and fitness resources. They can develop their skills. That's going to advantage them when they get to the high school level of sports, which of course will advantage them if they're looking to get to compete at the college level. But also, and I think this is really important, they have resources available for them to have a really fun childhood. That there's all kinds of fun stuff to do in their neighborhood, in their safer neighborhood, that really leads to unequal childhoods, depending on zip code. And that's really profound. And anyone, if you live in an urban area, you can drive around your city and you're going to see how unequal wealth is built right into the landscape. And that becomes a very powerful structural context in which people live out their lives. And then these kids, again, they have all this access to these resources. They're going to have competitive advantages, not just in sport, but in all sorts of different areas of schooling. And the ideology says, well, it was their hard work, their perseverance, and their discipline that led to that. So yeah, we can absolutely see how this is like profoundly impacting the outcomes in people's lives. Maybe Jay, you could talk a bit more. You started to talk about this, but a bit more about how segregation of sports based on wealth, right, creates these very unequal spaces and outcomes, particularly the way in which wealthy people are able to create their own sports and fitness context.
Yeah, and I think that any college student right now who's reading our book knows that the non-revenue sports in your college or university are sports that oftentimes only upper middle class individuals have easy access to. And And when you look at the neighborhoods where those individuals grew up, you see the country club access, the tennis club access, the lacrosse club access, all of those things, swimming club access, that that gave them opportunities to learn skills and to play in programs that had good coaches. They were in good facilities and venues. In fact, one of the great class projects that I did when I was teaching more than I do now was to have students take photos of the kinds of facilities that young people had access to. And, it was amazing what they came up with. I had upper middle class and upper class areas where young kids were riding horses, they were doing equestrian sports, they were doing all sorts of sports that kids in lower income areas had not even seen, much less had a chance to participate in. And so when we talk about college sports, we're talking about something that is really influenced by socioeconomic inequality. And the sports that people from low income areas participate in are the sports that have been focused on in low income areas. So the resources that they do have gone into basketball, they've gone into track and field, and in many cases, depending on the area of the country, they've gone into football because the people in those neighborhoods see those sports as the sports where you can make money as a professional. So what happens is that the high schools in those areas are they're in a cash bind in many cases, but the cash they do have emphasizes or funds those few sports where there are opportunities for college scholarships and professional contracts. And meanwhile, the sports in upper middle class high schools are emphasizing all of those so-called minor or non-revenue producing sports where young people are getting scholarships, but the scholarships are going to kids from wealthy families, relatively wealthy families. So when you sort it all out, what's happening is that socioeconomic inequality that starts at birth ends up paying off when you move from high school to college and into the rest of your lives.
What you're talking about, Jay, tracks in my own life. I'm thinking about, my younger son when he was in high school. And by the way, he went to a high school that was right in the center of downtown. So it wasn't a poor high school and it wasn't a wealthy high school, right? It was very much a middle class high school with some very wealthy kids, some very poor kids, but most kids, like us, very middle class. And so he played on the tennis team. And when we played the schools from the poorer neighborhoods, well, we always knew that he was going to have easy games because these were kids who never played tennis before they started high school and they joined the tennis team and they didn't have private coaching. Whereas when we played the wealthier schools, we knew he was going to get clobbered because those were kids that started playing tennis long before he did, because he didn't start playing tennis till the boys volleyball team was canceled discontinued during the pandemic lockdown. And he had a little bit of coaching. And he's such a funny kid because I was like, the coaching is really affordable at the city tennis courts. So, I'll sign you up for coaching. We can afford that. And he's like, no, but that's not fair, Dad, because the other kids on the team, they can't afford the coaching. You've been too, son, you've been too influenced by Jake Oakley. You're too ethical now. You don't want to separate yourself from your friends. But so those kids that are playing, that are going to those, that are in those wealthy neighborhoods, who started playing tennis when they were little kids, who grew up in country clubs where everybody played and they had access to quality coaching the whole way. Um, they're suddenly incredibly advantaged when they're in high school and when it comes time for winning scholarships. And maybe that's something we can talk. You started addressing this, Jay, but let's talk about that a bit more, because one of the things we say in the book is that college athletics in general are more the province of the privileged than the poor. But that's not what we think of typically when we think of college athletics. We focus on the football and the basketball, the revenue generating sports, the ones that are on national television year round. So maybe you can expand just a bit more about why wealthier kids are so advantaged when it comes to college sports and the winning of scholarships.
Yeah, and it goes way back to when kids are 4, 5, and 6 years old. We can talk about the opportunities to get into t-ball, for example. If you're a little kid growing up in an upper middle class area, and so that kind of inequality follows people throughout their entire lives, by the way. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about pickleball and older people and what their social class is. And so we're talking about from t-ball to pickleball here, with socioeconomic inequalities. But when it comes to issues related to college, we are now living in a situation where youth sports is based on a pay-to-play model. And that model is costing parents about $1,000 a year to keep their kids involved in a single sport, one child. Now, if you have 3 kids in a family and they're playing double sports, that takes you right out of the discretionary money reserves that you have in your family. You can't afford. So what you do is you pay to stay in one sport if you can afford that sport. And you pick a sport that is going to be available at your high school. And the high schools in lower income areas are more likely to have football, basketball, track and field, and you'll play those kinds of sports. So, and that carries over into college. So when coaches are recruiting, when they have full scholarships, they'll try to recruit young people from a variety of social class backgrounds, in a sense here, because they know that that even young people in the lower income areas have had access to playing football and playing basketball and participating on track and field teams, and in some cases playing volleyball. But if you're a coach in a non-revenue producing sport, and you have so many scholarships and you have to split them in order to make up a team, what happens is you're offering half scholarships, a third scholarships, a quarter. I've even seen individuals get less than a quarter scholarship. And if you're a coach doing that, then you're recruiting exclusively in upper middle class areas, because you have to find athletes coming from families who can afford the rest of the expenses. So you're not recruiting in low income areas. And even if there's a great tennis player or a lacrosse player in a low income area, and you don't have a full scholarship, you're going to pass them over to go for that young person in the upper middle class family whose family can afford to pay the difference between what you can offer and what college costs. And that's also starting to affect some of the Division I sports where there's full scholarships. And we'll talk about that later when we talk about school sports. But the young people playing, say the minoritized individuals, the black athletes in college, are now coming from middle and upper middle class homes in a much greater percentage than 2 generations ago. And you even see that at the pro level. The number of athletes whose fathers in the NBA and the NFL and Major League Baseball have played in those same sports. And so they have access to the kinds of training and facilities and equipment and so on that they need to develop their skills. So what's happening is that we've had a social classification of sports in a sense, social class rules within sports now because you have to have access to things that cost money. And so if you're a low income individual, you have to catch a lot of breaks along the way in order to make it even into high school sports in some cases. And to make it into college sports, social class becomes a real sorting filter. And that's started to be seen now at even the professional level. And when you look at individual sports where athletes are responsible for their own travel, buying their own equipment, once they pass high school level and college level, there you're talking about people who come from upper middle class families exclusively. You can't be a golfer unless you come from that kind of a family, unless someone has spotted you and has made a deal with you as a sponsor. But that deal often involves taking a percentage of your winnings if and when you ever have them. So you are sacrificing future winnings in tennis, golf, and other individual sports if you get involved in that kind of a sponsorship relationship. So those are some of the manifestations that we see now playing out in sport as you move up the pipeline. Social class is a filter in that pipeline.
And as you were talking, Jay, once again, it made me reflect on how this all tracks, with my own family history. My brother, I think I mentioned in our very first episode, he was a gymnast. Well, again, we were a middle-class family, not wealthy, but definitely not poor. And so my folks could afford to pay for his membership in a private club because as a kid, that's where you do gymnastics. In the United States, it's in private clubs, and the family has to be able to afford it in almost every situation. And so from the 6th grade all the way till he got to high school and started competing on the high school team, my parents paid for him to be on this private club. And that prepared him to be a standout on the high school team. And that got him a partial scholarship to the University of California at Berkeley. And I remember my folks talking about this. My mom was really surprised that he could only get a partial scholarship, and our family had to pay the rest for him to go to school at Berkeley. But it also, his grades in high school, he probably would not have gotten into Berkeley had it not been for the gymnastics coach advocating for him and offering the scholarship. So in a very real sense, the money that my parents paid towards his gymnastics as a kid was buying him into one of the most competitive public universities in the country. And then they were shocked, oh my God, it doesn't cover everything. And that's one of those things that people don't realize. Most of the college, as you were talking about, Jay, most of the college scholarships are only partial scholarships. And so it's incumbent upon the families to make up the difference there. But it's still an advantage getting into very prestigious universities. So there's all these ways in which class is playing out. I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the stadium building. Now, one of the things that the scholarship on stadium building, one of the phrases it often uses is public money for private profits. Now, we're always told, Jay, we're often told, we hear this all the time, that new stadiums increase tax money, they bring people together into a community. Why then are the people that study stadiums so dubious about communities investing in stadium building?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's a lot of people, by the way, who have asked that question along the way when they see how much public money is being spent, and they're contributing to that public money. By the way, they are asking questions about whether there's a payoff, and and whether they can believe the people who are trying to sell this idea of using public money to pay for a facility that's used by an owner, a private owner of a team, and athletes on that team who are making quite a bit of money. So, uh, so basically, the the research shows that those stadiums don't pay off in a direct way because uh, the the owners have control over a lot of that money that the stadium is generating, and they use that money for their own purposes. And by the way, that public money is also boosting the value of their franchise that they own. So they might have bought that franchise for $700,000 25 years ago, and now it's worth $4 billion. And the reason that it's worth that is that public money has provided them with a place to play, a place to locate their team, and they've provided the police support and other kinds of services that are needed to organize crowds, to control crowds, to handle the traffic, and all of those other things. So what's happening is that we're providing subsidies for billionaire owners to hire athletes at relatively high incomes, and we're using the money of people who can't even afford a ticket to that stadium. And and people are raising questions about that. And by the way, there's a number of cities right now in the United States where there's debates going on. How much are we going to ask the owner to pay, and how much is the city going to have to pay? And those are interesting kinds of negotiations because we're learning something about who benefits and who doesn't benefit from the existence of a stadium in a particular city. And by the way, the other thing is that there are businesses around stadiums that are going to benefit. But you know what? They're benefiting from the money being spent by people from the suburban areas who can afford to buy season tickets at that stadium and come to all the games and eat dinner around there and have drinks after the game around there. But what's happening is that the suburban restaurants and bars are losing money. Now, that's never taken into account in some of these studies that are being done to show the economic benefits that are being generated by a stadium. They focus on the stadium area. They don't focus on all the other areas that might be losing money when people go to the stadium area for basketball, hockey, and football, and now soccer, and spend their money there. So, and they're coming from other parts of the metropolitan area that now is wondering how I can keep my restaurant open or my bar open when everybody's spending money in the city right around those stadiums.
Jay, the research that has looked at this specific question finds that the economic benefit is a wash. And the reason is, we might talk about, people in the suburbs being upper middle class and, having this wealth, which they do relative to poorer people. But even those upper middle class people have a fixed amount of discretionary consumer wealth. They can only spend so much money on leisure and consumption. So what that means is if they're being drawn into the downtown, if they're being drawn to the downtown stadium and all the nice restaurants that open up or bars that open up around the stadium, well, they're going to spend that money there. They're exactly as you said, they're not going to spend it in their own neighborhood. And so absolutely the suburban bars and restaurants will then struggle because of the stadium. And so, yes, there are winners, but there are losers. And for the entire community, the net outcome is pretty much a wash. And so there is more complexity to these questions than we are typically presented in the media. And that moves me to my next question, because in fact, for most of us, our primary engagement with professional and other elite sports is, in fact, through the media. But rarely does the media give us a class analysis of sports, with the exception, I would say, of when professional athletes are on strike. And then they'll make pithy but pretty superficial statements like, it's millionaires versus billionaires. And the result of that, I would say, is that we're taught to view athletes as really important actors, people who are powerful. And certainly, if I think of LeBron James, there are some very important, powerful actors who are professional athletes. But Jane, who would you say holds the real power in sports? Is it the athletes?
If you're sitting at a negotiating table with an All-American status in a particular sport, and you have an agent and so on, you may be in a relatively good bargaining position. But most athletes are not in that kind of a bargaining position. And the other thing we forget about is that when we watch baseball on television, we forget about the minor leagues where athletes are living on salaries that are close to minimum wage in a number of cases. And when we watch tennis and golf and other individual sports on television, we don't understand that to get to the point where people are playing on television, those athletes had to pay their own way. They had to buy their own equipment. They had to pay for their own travel. And they had to have the resources to do that through a whole season in order to stay involved. So those sports serve as social class sorting devices. And when we're talking about team sports, not all athletes are making the big money in team sports. There are some team sports where athletes are still making money that isn't going to set them up for life, certainly. And they have to be very careful about how they spend their money. And that's another issue, is if you're coming from a lower income area and you end up making money in a professional sport, there's all sorts of people around you who would like you to share some of that wealth that you have. And if you spend that money on really expensive cars, and you have groups of individuals who you're, in a sense, kind of supporting with some of your money, what happens is that some of those professional athletes have gone broke over time. And, they're not set up for life. So the social class dynamics, even when we're talking about top-level professional sports, are more complex than we think. And we ignore all the so-called minor league sports, where the salaries are not as high as some of those people could be making outside of sports. So sports doesn't lead to upward social mobility to the extent that many people believe.
I want to throw out a classic sociological concept here, Jay, and have you respond to that. And it's the idea of the power elite. And C. Wright Mills, I think it was in the 1950s, maybe it was the 1960s when he coined that term. And, for most of us, we have some agency, we have some decision-making ability, but the decisions we make impact ourselves. Our decisions impact our families. The power elite are people who have decision-making ability that impacts thousands, if not millions, of other people. How would you say this idea of the power elite figures into the world of sport?
Well, certainly at the professional level, it provides people with leverage for getting access to property, to public money, and to the kinds of developmental projects that will continue to make them money. And so they use their leverage to 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 get public money supplied by taxpayers to build their own empire, sport empire, and those individuals not only influence what's going on in terms of control over the sports themselves, but they also influence what's going on in the media and what sports gets televised. And the classic example of that is golf versus football. And so a lot of people watch football from different social class backgrounds, but in golf, most of the viewers are going to be from upper middle class and upper class families. And so you may have golf, the Masters may have a rating that's far lower than an average NFL game. But the kinds of advertising rates that exist for the Masters and the US Open are really high because the people who are buying that advertising time know that the people who are watching are wealthy people. They're coming from backgrounds where they are in upper management level positions, and they're not buying insurance for themselves, Progressive car insurance or State Farm or Allstate. They're buying insurance for an entire corporation and for 5,000 employees. So if you're an insurance company, you want access to those individuals. They're buying fleets of cars. Most of us, we're buying one car every so many years. But the people who are watching tennis and golf are oftentimes buying fleets of cars for salespeople in their organization. And those are the people who those advertisers want access to. So what happens is that the media are slanted in terms of their coverage to emphasize the sports that people with money are more likely to watch than people who have less money. So that social class issue just filters through. And by the way, we forgot when we were talking about stadiums that inside a stadium, you have segregation by social class. And anybody who's been in a modern stadium now knows that there's the high income boxes, there's the other boxes that cost a little bit more, there's club seats, there's tickets, season ticket holder seats, and then there's the nosebleed seats. If you have enough discretionary money to even afford a nosebleed seat, you are being segregated from the time you walk into that stadium, because other people who are going into the club seats and into the box seats, they're going in different doors than you are. And they're exiting from different doors than you are. And the kinds of access to the amenities that they have are different than you have. So there's social class segregation, even though it's a little bit higher level, starts at a higher level. The bar is higher at the lowest level, but there's social class segregation within the stadium.
And that's so profound because the entire experience, right? You're both in the same stadium, you're both watching the same event, so there seems like equality, but your entire experience of it is very, very different. So Jay, I think we got time to squeeze in one more question because we're going to run long again. Um, so I want to shift the focus a bit, but still stay on this topic of unequal power within sports. Now, a lot of casual sports fan got a sudden lesson in sports economics when Caitlin Clark, the first draft pick in the WNBA draft this year in 2024, signed with the Indiana Fever for about $338,000 over 4 years. And so she's going to receive a base salary of $76,535 for her first year, whereas the lowest paid player in the NBA is getting a little over $1.1 million. So, Jay, how, as sociologists, do we explain this vast inequity in men's and women's pay?
If you're not familiar with social class kinds of issues and social class dynamics, you might say, well, of course, in the WNBA, they have fewer games, there's fewer teams, there's fewer tickets sold, fewer media viewers, and so on. But let's just move to beyond that for a second, and we'll compare Caitlin Clark, who was the number one draft choice in the WNBA this year, and we'll compare her with Victor Wembanyama, who was the number one draft choice of the San Antonio Spurs for the 2023-24 season. And he was signed for $12.2 million per year. And Caitlin Clark has $76,535 per year. Well, Caitlin Clark would have to play 159 seasons in order to match that salary. So despite some of the differences that are significant between the WNBA and the NBA, we have some interesting income differences, social class income differences between the players based on gender. And that example is a classic example, but it goes, you can compare across from any women's sports across to the similar men's sports, and you're going to find major differences in the payoffs for the women athletes versus the male athletes. So that's one of the things that is a big issue in women's sports right now. And people are talking about the Caitlin Clark effect and whether it's going to start to level things out a little bit. But it's going to take decades, if not a century, to start leveling things out because the inequalities are so great by gender.
And by the way, Jane, just focusing on the WNBA, I think one of the things that gets lost here, or the WNBA in relationship to the NBA, it's not a fair comparison to compare the WNBA in 2024 to the NBA in 2024. That's apples and oranges. A much better comparison is the WNBA in 2024 to the NBA in 1970, when both leagues were 30 years old or thereabouts. And when we do that comparison in terms of the number of people that show up to games, ticket sales are pretty close. In terms of the revenue generated by season, when controlling for inflation, it's pretty close. One of the things that really helped the NBA, or two things that have really helped the NBA in the period of the 1970s to 80s, 90s, up into the present, was one, the ABA merging with the ABA, and suddenly the NBA moved out of just the Northeast, or largely the Northeast, and became a continental league. And so it opened up markets that didn't previously exist. And then also, under David Stern as the commissioner, had an incredible marketing campaign since the 1980s and 1990s. that has made the NBA a global league, not just a national league. And I think that's an important point here is women's sports across the board suffers from a lack of investment. First, lack of investment in their facilities and other resources available. I've seen in colleges where the men's basketball team can be mediocre, and yet they get air flights to their games. And then in the same school, the women's team can be, a perennial powerhouse, and they have to take the bus. The locker rooms are different, the training facilities are different, but also the investment in marketing is different. Even a mid-tier men's program will be heavily marketed, whereas a elite women's program will be, poorly marketed. So one of the things that this past couple of seasons of women's basketball has shown is it's not simply about the product on the court that makes one really valuable versus the other. People are very excited about watching women's sports. When it comes to tennis, personally, more often than not, I'd rather watch women's matches. I think they're much more exciting than men's matches, right? Across the board. But there still are these profound discrepancies because the investments in those sports are profoundly different. And that doesn't get talked about in the media. And that's the role of sociology, to talk about these things.
Yeah, and I haven't seen an actual study of the number of dollars invested in say the WNBA and the NBA back during the time period you're talking about, and then putting everything into 2004 dollars, converting it into 2004 dollars. And if we did that, what we would find is the kinds of investments that were being made during that time that you're talking about were massive compared to the kinds of investments that are occurring even now in the WNBA. So basically, if we can hold constant the context, the economic context within which these changes were occurring, we're finding that women are still getting shortchanged in a major way in terms of how the WNBA is being marketed, and compared to how the NBA was marketed back a number of years ago. So if we wanted to take a 30-year period and just compare what's going on in terms of investment, in terms of constant dollars in 2004 dollars, we would see massive differences. And if I have time, I'm going to try to do that. But that's a big task, and I'll need an economics person to help me out. But basically, women's sports have been shortchanged from the get-go, and we can provide the data to prove that. But people haven't dug deep enough to provide all the data.
Right. And another simple point that we can think about here is in the 1970s, when the NBA was getting ready to take off, it was a men's league led by men. Now, people say, oh, the NBA subsidizes the WNBA, and to a certain degree, that's true. David Stern started the WNBA as an investment to expand the basketball audience, bring in more women fans. But the WNBA is a women's league whose decisions are being made by men in a men's league. And so, again, gender ideology plays in here in very important ways. And as you said earlier, Jay, we want to think intersectionality, and how do class ideology mix with gender ideology and mix with racial ideology, and so on and so forth. And I hope that the people listening to this episode are getting a sense of that. So we're out of time now. We should bring this episode to a close. I think it's another Excellent episode. Thank you so much, Jay. In our next episode, our focus returns to athletic bodies when we discuss Chapter 10, Age and Ability, Barriers to Participation and Inclusion. Thanks so much, Jay, and I'll be looking forward to talking to you again on our next episode.
So it's been a pleasure, Jeff, and I look forward to it as well. And I hope that our listeners have raised some critical questions about what's going on in sport when it comes to social class.